Hello there, creeps, and welcome to another episode of Madams and Murderers. I'm your host, Malie Molino, and before I get started, I just wanted to take a second and thank you to everyone who has been listening, sharing, rating, and reviewing the podcast. This really has been a journey so long in the making, and all the messages and reviews truly make it worth it, so thank you guys so much. In our last episode about the Stingery in San Diego, I touched on the historical and current anti-Asian racism that has and is plaguing our country. That racism has deep roots for a lot of different reasons, but one of the most common forms of Asian racism is the hypersexualization of the women. To understand why this is, we need to further look into the history of the Chinese coming to America, whether by choice or by force. As we will learn, Chinese women were seen as exotic, favored by both the white men who made up the majority of the population and the Chinese men, and thus most of the Chinese women who found themselves in America in the mid-1800s found themselves forced into prostitution to serve the needs of the men who desired them. It was an awful situation for hundreds of women. There was one woman, though, who saw the situation for what it was and all its fucked upness, and when she arrived in San Francisco shores, decided to take control. Ladies and gents, it's time we tell the tale of San Francisco's most famous Chinese madam, Ah Toy. The history of Chinese men in America goes back to the 1700s, when the Spanish still had control over Mexico and what is now California. Working as fishermen and merchants, a small few still remained when California became, California. But it wasn't until the 1840s, when news of gold being found in the Golden State reached China, that a large migration of Chinese men came to America. Like everyone else at the time, they hoped to make it rich quickly and then return home where their wives and children were waiting. In fact, it was only the merchants that were allowed to bring their wives and children. This is just the beginning of the various ways the Chinese were denied rights or privileges. Willing to accept low wages since they were sending money back home where the cost of living was much cheaper, they found themselves being taken advantage of in every way possible, most famously with the building of the railroads, a job they got little to no money for. It extended further, though, to trades and factories where the owners would lay off the white men to hire the Chinese men that would work for much less. This was one of the catalysts in the growing racism towards the Chinese. The white men literally saw them taking their jobs and blamed them instead of the business owners who made the decision. They also took jobs as domestic servants, launderers, and shopkeepers. Fun fact, after the Civil War, it was mainly Chinese men working the plantations. That is something you don't hear about a lot. Since they were foreigners, they weren't allowed to join any unions, which is one of the reasons why they were paid so poorly. Later on, they instead formed their own guilds, which helped at least regulate payments and protections. But as you can see, all I'm talking about is the men. Where the hell are the women? Some men were able to bring their wives. By some, I basically mean like 3, since in San Francisco in 1850, there were all of 7 Chinese women and over 4,000 men. This would change very rapidly, though, with the Chinese sex trade. In 1870, U.S. Census shows that 61% of the Chinese women in America were working as prostitutes. That's out of 3,536 women. So how in a matter of 20 years did we go from 7 women to thousands of prostitutes? Easy. Men. Not only did white men desire Chinese women, so did the Chinese men. Just like with every other crude city or town where there are more men than women, people see dollar signs, so they find a way to provide the service everyone wants: sex. Unlike many of the white women who saw opportunities and moved themselves to mining or lumber towns, many of the Chinese women brought to America were literally kidnapped in China, sold, put on a ship bound for America, where they were then forced into prostitution, most notably in San Francisco. It was a seedy and dark time that, if we're gonna be honest, hasn't completely stopped. But this isn't to say that all the Chinese women were powerless. In fact, the desire for Chinese prostitutes in San Francisco can sort of be traced back to a woman, and that is both conflicting and sad. On a steamship bound for San Francisco in 1849 from Hong Kong is a young married couple with gold dreams in their eyes. Ah Toy, a tall, 20-year-old beautiful Chinese woman with the traditional bound feet of higher classes, is traveling with her husband, who dies on the journey. Now, I don't know about y'all, but if I was her, I would have panicked. Your husband just died, you're all alone on the sea, bound for a foreign country. What do you do? Thankfully, she was a quick thinker and she becomes the mistress to the ship captain. I want to mention that we don't know if she seduced him or he forced her. And I just want to make that clear because although this relationship would benefit her in way of gold, great treatment, and literally a small fortune when they would arrive in San Francisco, it's possible the relationship started not by her choice, and it's important we acknowledge that. Okay, so now she's in San Francisco, and there is some debate here because some historians say she was the second Chinese woman to arrive in the city, beat by a female servant. Others say she was one of the 7 I mentioned earlier from the 1850 census. Honestly, doesn't really matter. What does matter is she's very aware that she's one of very few, and being beautiful, she notices the attention she's getting. So she makes a plan. She starts charging men for a lookie, basically a peep show, in a small crib in the heart of what is now San Francisco's Chinatown. And she charges a lot. You could either pay in an ounce of gold, which at the time was roughly 18 bucks, which in today's monies is closer to $600. So yeah, she's turning a profit. This earns her the title of the first Chinese prostitute in San Francisco, and it's a title she'll wear proudly. It's said that the line of men waiting to get a look at her was always a block long, and her reputation traveled. In the mining communities around Sacramento, men heard of the exotic woman who would let you get a look at her, and men from all over, when they arrived in the city, would rush to get in line. To put it plainly, Toy is making a killing, and she decides to expand in 1850 when 5 more Chinese girls arrive. She snags 2 and opens a bordello on Pike Street, an alleyway that will be known for some of the nicest brothels for the next 70 years. In 1852, hundreds of kidnapped and sold Chinese girls and women would land in the bay. There was a very specific way in which this was handled. The ship would arrive. The women would then be loaded into carts, crowded together, where they would then be brought to a basement in Chinatown, where they would then be stripped naked and examined by both brothel owners and buyers for wealthy Chinese men looking for mistresses. Ah Toy would take part in this, buying the women for around $300 each to bring to what was now the beginning of her brothel empire. I have mixed feelings about this, mainly because these women weren't there by choice. They were literally kidnapped, and instead of trying to help end this trade, she was contributing, and in a big way. The flip side of this was the women were there. They needed somewhere to go, and since the opportunities for Chinese women in the workforce were close to none, at least this way she could protect some of them under her care. I say that, though, with little to no facts to back up that she was caring for them. In doing my research, there was very little written about how she treated her girls in the brothels, which is odd since most historical madam stories usually include their treatment of their prostitutes. However, this could be because they were white and she wasn't, and perhaps that's just not a part of the story people cared to report then. The one and only piece of information I could find was her arrest in 1859 for beating one of her girls. So that's not great. Perhaps that's an insight into how she handled them, or perhaps it was an isolated incident. What is fact is she was picky about her girls' looks and demanded the most beautiful. We also know she did not play when it came to money. Not only was she gorge, she was a smart businesswoman, and living in America, she quickly learned the legal system and was not afraid to take men to court who had scammed her with brass coins instead of gold. And she was fearless enough to threaten legal action against a gang leader who tried to make her and other madams pay taxes. Her relationship with the law would be murky, though, because she would be arrested and taken to court on multiple occasions for running a disorderly house, something the white madams never faced. In fact, it was always the Chinese brothels that were being brought up on charges. This got worse when a bunch of Protestant dudes formed a vigilance committee to try and rid the city of brothels, but mainly the Chinese ones. This was happening at a time when lots of laws were being put into place that were making life for the Chinese really hard without overtly making it about race. That is a practice that continued and got worse, such as the 500 cubic feet clean air ordinance of the 1870s that stated everyone must have their own space of 500 cubic feet in a residential setting, which meant most of Chinatown was illegal. And of course, the eventual Chinese Exclusion Act of the 1880s, that essentially made it illegal for the Chinese to come to America. There were some variants in that, but that's essentially what it was, and it didn't change until World War II when America decided to not hate China as much. I also want to point out that it was illegal for the Chinese to marry white folks. What wasn't illegal was Chinese marrying African Americans, which happened a lot. Literally 60% of the marriages of Chinese men in the 1800s was of that nature. Fun fact, it wasn't until World War II and the 1940s in general that restrictions on white Asian marriages lessened. A lot of this is due in part to the amount of white soldiers who married Asian women during the war, and this started another wave of hypersexualization of Asian women in American culture that absolutely is still being felt today. But back to Aotoy. In 1854, San Francisco made it illegal for the Chinese to testify in court or sue people. That sucks for her because she can no longer threaten people into honest business with fear of the law, and she can't defend herself when she's unfairly arrested. In 1857, she's officially over it, and she's like, fuck y'all, I'm rich, this city sucks, I'm going back to China, screw y'all. And she does, but she returns in 1859, where in a matter of weeks, she's rearrested for running a disorderly house. Then she's arrested again for that beating we talked about earlier, and then a third time, again for her poorly run house, supposedly. If you're keeping track, that's 3 arrests in less than 6 months. And it's at this point that 27-year-old or 28-year-old, not quite sure, Aotoy sells her bordellos and basically fades from the history books. There was a lot of speculation about what she did for the rest of her life. Some say she went to China, which she may have done. However, we do know she would die February 1st, 1928 in San Jose, California, just shy of her 100th birthday. Here's where our research got its head strange. When attempting to find where she was buried, because if y'all know me, I'm a professional grave hunter and it's what I do, I happened upon a series of essays written about a China Mary of Alviso, and it's turning some of our story on its head. Firstly, these alternate stories claim that Aotoy did not become a widow on the ship over from China. In fact, it said she came alone, and her first appearance in court was in 1849, the year of her arrival, when Chinese leaders of the community received a letter from a man back in Hong Kong claiming to be her husband and demanding she return home. These leaders take her to court where she testifies that she is not married, and the judge believes her, and she continues on to become the madam we just talked about. These same essays go on to describe her life after she leaves her empire in San Francisco, saying she ended up marrying a wealthy Chinese man, and when he died, she spent the rest of her life selling clams to tourists. In fact, the obituary written about her, or who I believe to be her because dates add up, says this: San Jose, February 2nd. One of Santa Clara County's most familiar figures, Aotoy, known to thousands as China Mary of Alviso, who, had she lived 3 more months, would have been 100 years old, was buried in Oak Hill Cemetery here yesterday afternoon, a few hours after her death. One of the first Chinese women to come to San Jose in pioneer days, China Mary had lived in the local Oriental Quarter until the death of her husband 25 years ago. She then moved to a small house in Alviso, selling clams to tourists and yachting parties in order to make a living. She kept house in Alviso for her brother-in-law, known as Chinese Louis. The aged Chinese woman, according to records in her possession, was born in 1828. She leaves a number of children in China. Children? Okay, so y'all can see how this sounds like it could be our girl, but there are for sure elements presented here that just don't add up to the story we've told. Except maybe they do. Maybe she had children in China before she left. Maybe she had some when she went back. Could this woman be our empowered madam? I think so. Revered as one of the most famous madams of San Francisco's history, Aotoy's story is full of intrigue, tragedy, and mystery. As with so many of the women we feature, there is much about her life that we will never know. It's impossible to grasp what it would have been like for her, virtually alone in a country where no one looked like her, where the people saw her as a foreign object to own. Her story is one of perseverance and courage. It's not perfect, and to say she didn't contribute to a deadly trade would be a lie. However, I think she did what she had to do to survive. Thank you guys so much for listening to today's tale. If you've enjoyed today's episode, please take a second to rate, review, and subscribe. It means so much to me. I also want to mention that sex trafficking is something that is still happening. Some 40 million girls and women each year are forced into sex work without their consent. And the continued fetishization of Asian women contributes to both murders and racism. The recent terrorist attack at the Atlanta massage parlors being a perfect example of this. In the show notes, I have provided links to resources to help end sex trafficking and stop Asian hate. I urge you to check them out. If you haven't yet, please check out my YouTube channel. I have 4 shows where you can binge tons of haunted, macabre, and hilarious history. I am so close to hitting 2,000 subscribers, and it would mean so much to me if you would help me out. I also have tons of daily spooky content on my Instagram, which is a great place for you to contact me if you have any ideas on what you'd like to hear me talk about on the podcast. Until next week, Cin Cin Creeps.